Welcome to the first of 4 fall speaker series in our State of the Rockies, The Scales of Western Water themed extravaganza. Our first speaker tonight will be Scott Campbell, an alum from the class of 1991, and he was also a 2015 Lincoln Loeb Fellow at Harvard University's Graduate School of Design, former director of the Palmer Land Trust. In its incarnation is probably how you knew of Scott if you came and you're not enrolled at CC or bribed or cajoled to come here tonight. So we're really happy to see a good crowd. I do want to preview a couple things about our work this past summer. The rotating slide gallery of fame and sometimes shame, if the picture is embarrassing, shows a little bit of the highlights of the fieldwork that we're engaged with by the group this year. And I want to point out and recognize Brendan Bopel. Where are you, Brendan? Brendan, stand up to be recognized. Where are you? Yay, Brendan. All right. I want to thank Brooke Larson. Please stand. Be recognized. No. There you go. Jonah Seifer, an EV chem grad. He's a senior this year. Is Burke Huey here? Paging Burke Huey. Econ major. All right, I'll find him. Maya Williamson is abroad. And then John Jennings is the real John Jennings here. There he is, right at the back. Okay, great. So that was our team this year, and they had a great time during the summer and have engaged in serious report writing now, putting their game faces back on while they return to campus. I want to preview a couple of the other events we have coming this fall. The next event is Thursday, September 24th at 7 p.m. This is a joint event, with Alumni Association, the local chapter from Notre Dame University. No? No Go Irish out of the random blue? Okay. Anyway, we're partnering with them. It's a perfect opportunity. We have historian Annie Gilbert Coleman joining us from Notre Dame, and she'll be speaking about the cost of experience, how outdoor sports pull mountains apart and put them back together again. I'm really intrigued by this. She is a noted environmental historian and has written a book called Ski Style, Sport and Culture in the Rockies. So if you're not here on that day, you're probably at the wrong college. Okay. Our next speaker is Tuesday, November 3rd, same room, same time, 7 p.m. It's Tuesday, November 3rd. Innovative Water Management, New Tools for Securing Water for People and Nature. And that's going to be Erwin Duringson. He's the agricultural coordinator for the Nature Conservancy on the Colorado River program. And he's going to talk to us about some of the experiments they're doing with leasing and alternative arrangements to keep agriculture alive, as well as fish and rivers alive here in Colorado. Finally, we'll close with something a little different. On Wednesday, November 18th, a screening, right, with the director, Jim Havey, who actually directed and is the producer of The Great Divide. Destiny of the West is written in the headwaters of the Colorado. It reads like a 19th century subtitle, but trust me, it'll be a great way to kind of close off the fall semester in our speaker series, just at the right time, too, as Colorado is engaging in its first state water plan. So if you have not paid attention to the Colorado Water Plan, well, now's the time to do it, but also come join us for these events. All right, without further ado, let me introduce our speaker tonight, Scott Campbell. As I said, he's an alum. And he just spent the last year at Harvard helping them think through tough problems, because I hear they need some help at Harvard. So I'm glad that we could lend some of our local talent there, and I'm sure they'll start to figure things out up in Cambridge. Scott's work spans the intersection of conservation, preservation, economics, and community development in Colorado, where urban communities and agricultural towns face juxtaposed trends of growth, decline, at the same time because of the consumptive land use patterns and competition for limited water resources. For 7 years, Scott directed conservation efforts at one of the country's largest land trusts, the Palmer Land Trust, which worked to protect over 50,000 acres during his tenure, contributing to over a 100,000-acre conservation portfolio. Scott founded the Protect the Peak Conservation Initiative, say that 10 times, an effort to build a contiguous ring of protected public and private lands around America's mountain, Pikes Peak, or as it's known, TAVA. Co-founded the Colorado Scenic Byways Conservation Coalition, a statewide coalition dedicated to land protection along many of the country's premier national scenic byways. Before joining Palmer Land Trust, Scott served in the Colorado Office of Economic Development and International Trade under Governor Bill Owens. There he spearheaded the team that launched Colorado's Heritage Tourism Program, helping communities capitalize upon the more than $1.2 billion in natural and cultural resource preservation investments Colorado has made through the Great Outdoors Colorado Trust Fund, GOCO, and the Colorado State Historical Fund. Scott is the recipient of the 2015 Livesey Award for Social Change at Colorado College. Past awards have included Palmer Land TrustLocal Southern Colorado Conservation Awards, and he's also been recognized by the American Society of Landscape Architects, the Jane Silverstein Rees Awards, and, to top it off, an El Pomar Award for Excellence. So, without further ado, please help me welcome Mr. Scott Campbell.
Well, as I was saying, what a nice homecoming. What a nice honor to have the award from Colorado College this past year. Thank you very much. A lot of the other awards that Eric had mentioned were really awards that went to Palmer Land Trust, and I know there are a lot of Palmer trustees and staff, past and present, who are here tonight, and I want to thank you for coming. It's just such a great organization to work with, and really made for a terrific year out at Harvard, building off the work that we all did together in the Pikes Peak region and the lower Arkansas Valley. So thank you, CC, for the award, for hosting me. Thank you, Palmer, and the friends that are here. It's really wonderful to be back here. This is a great institution, very formative in my life, and a terrific place to be getting your foot wet, so to speak, in this kind of work. One of my tasks tonight, I think, as the first speaker, is to bridge last year's subject, which is large landscape conservation, with this year's subject, which is the scales of Western water. And land trusts like the one I am from are more and more focusing on larger and larger landscapes. The Palmer Land Trust is one of 1,700 land trusts around the country that have protected as much land as is encompassed by our national park system. They are essentially working with lands that are at risk, unprotected, and ensuring that those lands are permanently protected, open, providing essential ecosystem services that we all depend on, protecting our food-growing regions. And they are protecting about 2 million additional acres of land or more every year. So it is really one of the most successful conservation movements afoot these days. And they are working at larger and larger scales, which is really important when we start to look at river systems, because we need the kind of scale where we can begin to address our water supply and water quality and our ecology issues at a basin-wide scale. So it's great to be linking the work, the terrestrial conservation work I was doing with the water conservation work that has been more and more a part of my focus. You know, the other bridge that I think exists between the scales of Western water conservation and a previous State of the Rockies project was the project that focused on the Colorado. And of course, a key historic figure during that year of study was John Wesley Powell, the first to float the Colorado, very formative figure in our early surveys and the surveys that eventually became the U.S. Geological Survey. And Powell had advocated to Congress that essentially that we don't follow and we don't bring the Eastern method of looking at section range township for land development and governance that we have out east, out west. He said, you know, with the limited resources that we have out west, we should really be governing by looking at hydrologic basin. And of course, that didn't happen, but a lot of the work that land trusts, especially large national trusts, like one of your next speakers is coming from, Aaron Derwinson, who works for the Nature Conservancy. They are now focusing on these larger and larger scales, and even small land trusts like Palmer are part of a more integrated network, realizing we have to focus on a very large scale. Before I start my presentation, I'd like to just have you take in this image, this cartographic image that was done by Harold Fisk in the 50s. It shows the Arkansas River, which I'm going to be talking a lot about tonight because I can't talk about all of America's rivers, so let's talk about the one where we're actually in that basin right here. It's not the only one I'm going to be talking about, but it's one of them. This map shows where the Arkansas meets the Mississippi River, and it illustrates all of the historic channels that the Arkansas, the white to the north, let me see if I can operate this, and the Mississippi here has occupied. And you really get a sense of the very the changing nature, the variable nature of this river system historically. And I want you to keep the changing nature of this river system in mind, because it will be real important as we get further into the talk tonight. So that changing nature is really indicative of a healthy river ecology. We're going to be talking about problems of ecology tonight. We're also going to be talking about problems of supply. I'm going to start with supply, move to ecology, and then we're going to look at some emerging frameworks that conservation practitioners are really beginning to employ to address both of these problems. So in addition to focusing on the Arkansas River, the watershed of which you see here in the center of the country, I'm also going to draw from examples of what's happening in conservation efforts in the Connecticut River up in New England, the Colorado Basin in the Intermountain West. And part of the reason I wanted to look at these two rivers, there's a couple of reasons. One of them is that the Arkansas is a river that is essentially divided by the 100th meridian, and where it exists in Colorado and Kansas, it exists in a very semi-arid environment where we see less than 20 inches of rain a year. And then as we move through Oklahoma and Arkansas, where it finally joins the Mississippi, we're in a much wetter environment. So I wanted to look at rivers that were in wetter contexts and drier contexts, because the Arkansas it changes so much. Part of my reason for looking at the Arkansas is obviously that is a river that we were heavily focused on here in Palmer Land Trust, and our work was occurring within a very particular context here. And of course, any intervention you have on a river, whether you're a city looking for supplies, whether you're a conservationist looking to improve in-stream flows, has an impact upon other users, natural and human, of that system. So part of my year at Harvard was actually spent looking at the larger system. And one of the other reasons that I wanted to focus on the Connecticut and the Colorado is it's two rivers in our country that have basin-wide, very strong basin-wide conservation programs taking place in them. And the Nature Conservancy and other organizations are very active in those. So again, looking at that scale, that multi-state, basin-wide scale that we're going to need to really be effective caretakers of these rivers. A couple things to note about the rivers. The Connecticut River, which is New England's largest freshwater ecosystem, is also North America's most dammed watershed. The Arkansas River, which is the second longest tributary of the Mississippi River, is also, it has the distinction of having the most expensive Army Corps of Engineers project to date, at least at the time of its construction, completed on it, a 500-mile lock and dam system, essentially from the mouth that goes up to just outside of Tulsa, Oklahoma. We typically think of these, these giant dams on the Colorado as being these huge public works projects. This one is less visible, but very intensive development on this river. And then, of course, the Colorado, which has had this amazing event last year of the pulse flow, and the distinction of 16 years prior to that having the waters in the system not meet the Gulf of California, not meet the sea. So we think of that as a very over-appropriated system. As we look at the context, again, that conservation groups are working in these systems, it's important to note that there are very different legal contexts in the Connecticut than what we will find in the Colorado, and the Arkansas actually has some of both of these contexts. If you are a landowner out east where there are ample water supplies, you're operating in a riparian doctrine, a riparian water law context, which essentially means that if you have a river running through your property, you have the right to reasonably appropriate some of those supplies for your own use. That may not be the case in Colorado. You may have a river running through your property, but you may not have the right to appropriate those supplies. Likewise, you may be able to appropriate supplies that are not on your property if you develop those supplies for beneficial use. And under the prior appropriation doctrine, where water is a private usufruct property right. It can be bought, sold, traded, inherited. The way you establish that right is essentially to develop the resource for some type of beneficial use, and you codify your right in a court that gives you a decree, and you end up with an appropriation and an adjudication date for the development of that source. And that is set in a system of water users where you fall into a certain priority. And what you would like there is to have a more senior right. As they say, first in time is first in right. And if there is a limited supply flowing down the river and your right is more junior, you need to cease from taking those supplies until more senior rights holders are served. So an important context that we are going to look at here tonight. Last thing in terms of some context setting before we get into the problems of supply, I want to talk a little bit more about how we're operating as conservation professionals, particularly with a land trust focus. Essentially, we are working to protect land and water resources by obtaining real interests in that property. So we're either purchasing property outright in order to protect it, or we're placing some kind of deed restriction on the property, or working with a landowner on a voluntary basis to acquire a deed of conservation easement on the property that protects the land and restricts development on that land that would hinder the conservation values. Now, what are those values? Well, when we're talking about large landscapes, there's really two. We're talking about ecosystem functioning. We're talking about relatively natural habitat for fish, plants, animals. We're also talking about the preservation of open space for farm or forest land. So we're talking about agriculture. We're talking about our food growing lands. And one thing to keep in mind as we think about the drier regions of the Arkansas and at the State of the Rockies project in general, the Intermountain West, is when you are west of the 100th meridian, where you have less than 20 inches of rainfall a year, supplemental irrigation is required for most agricultural operations. That's really key. And Powell knew that when he was making his recommendations to Congress about the way we need to govern ourselves around our water resources. So in any event, we're trying to protect ecosystems. We're also trying to protect our food growing regions. That's the focus that I'm coming from tonight. Why are we really looking at large landscapes? Well, we're trying to address some serious problems in our land use patterns. The scale of what needs to be done these days is much greater than what we're going to be able to address through typical planning and zoning protocols. We need to promote ecosystem health at much larger scales. We also, part of the impact that we've had on our land, our footprint, is contributing to climate change. We want to mitigate that, prepare to adapt to it. And then, of course, the wonderful thing about Land Trust 2 is I think we can also be a tool, a community planning tool to address specific needs that are within the communities that we work in. And of course, it goes without saying that if you're working in large scales, you can more effectively manage these freshwater resources. So, you know what I forgot to mention here? This is just, since we're talking about the Arkansas, let me just highlight the photo here. This is a picture of the BX Ranch. I'm out there with students from Harvard, staff from the Nature Conservancy. This is one of Palmer Land Trust's most recent conservation projects. It was a large shortgrass prairie protection project, 25,000 acres, just over the river, south of the river from Chico Basin Ranch. A great protection project. You can really, the reason I want to show this here is you can really see how dry the landscape is out west. And this is the landscape. That's not an irrigated piece of land. It's a very large, great piece of grazing land. It's an agricultural piece of land. It's a great piece of native prairie habitat. But this is what is really required for the farms that lie adjacent to that property. And the farms that are lying adjacent to that property are essentially our Pueblo chili growing region just on the east side of the city of Pueblo. But this is an early irrigation work that was established to carry water to lands like those of the BX that really needed this additional water to be able to grow food. So with that in mind, let's get into some of these supply problems. So over the last year, as my research on water was taking place, my mother, who leans Democratic, and my father, who leans Republican, my stepfather, would send me news articles sort of highlighting where the problems of our Western water crisis are really lying. So I thought I'd throw these up here today. My apologies, Mom and Ed. I think they're watching the live stream right now. But this is just it's so wonderful. It's so indicative of the issues that we have. In this article from the New York Times, this is an op-ed by a citizen named Mark Bittman, titled Making Sense of Water. He says, almost every number used to analyze California's drought can be debated, but this can be safely said: agriculture consumes more than its fair share. And then here in the High Country News, captions and quotations in an article by Sarah Torrey, thirsty cities along Colorado's Front Range are buying up farmers' water, hollowing out entire agricultural communities, making the case that, well, these are private property rights. These agricultural owners have owned them for 4 or 5 generations. It's the cities that are changing the playing field. And then over here in the Wall Street Journal, we have U.S. Representative Tom McClintock saying in another op-ed piece, the state desperately needs water, yet huge pulse flows are going to the Pacific to benefit fish, saying, look, we're having problems supplying people in cities, we're having problems supplying our farms. Why are we sending these huge pulse flows into the Pacific? And to some extent, you can see how this is an emotionally charged issue, and to some extent, you can see the validity in each of these arguments. Of course, when we think about supply problems, this is a rather famous image that came out in a recent Army Corps of Engineers study on Colorado river supply. It shows up here in the blue line the supply average from the 1920s to the 2000s. And one thing to keep in mind here is on the Colorado River, our 7-state Colorado River Compact, which was first penned, later altered, in the early 1920s, was set during a time when flows were really unusually high in the river. So the appropriation of 16.5 million acre feet between the upper basin states, the lower basin states, and Mexico came at a time where it seemed like there was much more than 16.5 million acre feet of water in the river. And what we know is this is more indicative of what the supplies really look like, and with climate change forecasts, we believe those will be continuing to decrease. Now, the usage, on the other hand, has increased, and we hit a very famous point back around 2002 where our usage of those waters had crossed that supply line, and we have leveling out supplies and projected increasing demand. But one of the key points that I would like to make tonight, even though we have so much national focus on the shortages in the Colorado River, is we can really look to the river, the basin where we are tonight, as being a crucible for what we may face in terms of problems and solutions across the American West. The Arkansas River is the largest basin in terms of surface area in the state of Colorado, but it carries the least amount of water of any of our major basins. It serves, along with the Platte and some interbasin transfer water, a lot of interbasin transfer water, it serves 86% of our population, which lies on the Front Range, but 80% of our water is on the western slope. So it is a very, very over-appropriated system, and Peter Nichols, a water attorney who's been a great mentor of mine here in the state, another CC alum, calls it the crucible, really, for what we may see across the American West. And we're going to talk about some of the problems that have been evolving there, problems that are only going to continue to increase or become more poignant and heightened as our population grows. Back in 2010, we have a population that's growing nearly twice the national average. Back in 2010, we had slightly over 5 million people living in the state. We may see as many as 10 million people living here by 2050. So most of those people are going to be living here along the Front Range in cities like Colorado Springs, Denver, Fort Collins, Pueblo, not projected to grow quite as much. Here in this NASA image, you can see the Arkansas River leaving the mountains, entering the prairie. You know, we have a very large, most people think of the mountains in Colorado, but we have, you know, over a third of the state in prairie. You can also see the Santa Fe Trail, where settler culture, it was one point where settler culture came, arrived, settled, and spread out west. And we have a lot of historic agricultural lands along this river corridor. One other thing I'd like to point out in this slide is, in addition to the growth that's going to occur here, I'd like to point out the impact on land, the footprint, the conversion that has already taken place. We can see here, you know, the impact that our cities have had. You can see the greens. You can see the development, even from space. But what you can also see is that there is sort of a pockmarked area of lands right here, and that is where native prairie has been tilled. These are agricultural lands. In the early 20th century, they were a lot of dryland farms. Today, they are irrigated from groundwater sources, some non-renewable, some renewable, but the rate of extraction is greater than the recharge that is taking place in the aquifer. And so when we really think about sustainable supplies, even with diminished flows in the face of climate change, we need to be looking at the agricultural land along our river system as a real sustainable source of food production. The other thing you can see down here that's just interesting to note is that there's not a lot of conversion taking place in this area. Just a remarkable area, one of our largest native prairie ecosystems left in the country, down in this portion of southeastern Colorado. And of course, Steve has taken a lot of beautiful photos of the prairie, which many of you at CC have seen. So again, the Arkansas being the crucible, supply problems really began here, and if we're going to solve some of the issues that they've created, they may need to be solved here. If you want to see how fast the waters were appropriated, take a look at the percentage of time these major water rights are in priority. The earliest water rights up here, established with appropriation dates of 1861, a year before the Homestead Act, in priority 100% of the time. By 1874, we see the last water rights decree in priority 100% of the time. That's 2 years before statehood. By 1887, right here, water rights that were appropriated in that year today are in priority less than 50% of the time. By the 1890s, less than 10% of the time. So if your great or great-great-grandfather was appropriating water for agricultural or municipal purposes out of the Arkansas River in the 1890s, what that essentially means is that there is not enough water in the system to supply your water needs 90% of the time. So what we began to see, in addition to conflicts that were not only occurring within our state for water, but with Kansas downstream, we had with Kansas one of the longest running Supreme Court battles over water, beginning with 1902 in Kansas versus Colorado, and of the 5 decisions that have been handed down, our recent one, I believe, was in favor of Kansas in 2009, is that right? I'm looking at Tad Foster, another water attorney here who's worked with the city of Colorado Springs, but I believe it was 2009. Oh, there it is. I have it right there in my very own slide. Should read what I write. But in any event, we had these interstate issues as well. But again, with that kind of supply issue, one of the things that you start to see happening is you start to see interbasin transfers, ditches built in the Colorado Basin to bring water into the Arkansas that same time period in the 1890s, and then larger tunnels being constructed storage reservoirs for supply, for flood control, with sort of the development of those peaking and ending in the 1970s. And one of the things that we begin to notice in the 1970s, although it was happening before that, is a trend that many of you may be familiar with, this trend called buy and dry. So if you are in need of water in an over-appropriated river system, and water is a private property right that can be bought, sold, exchanged, one of the things that you can do to buy a senior supply in an over-appropriated system is to acquire it and purchase it from another user. This slide here, which shows one of Palmer Land Trust's planning areas in, here's the city of Pueblo, Pueblo Reservoir, the Arkansas River moving through here. So planning areas occupying Pueblo County, Crowley County, Otero County, Colorado Springs would be right up here, right up Fountain Creek. This slide shows farmland that is prime, meaning the soils have optimal growing characteristics in green, and irrigated, which is also green. It also shows soils that were once prime and irrigated, but have succumbed to this buy and dry trend. And that trend essentially out here in Crowley County, as we see, is a trend where cities have actually purchased, in the 70s and 80s, it was 55,000 acres that were purchased largely by the city of Colorado Springs, the city of Aurora, Pueblo as well, has been acquiring supplies in this area during that time. And it dried up a large portion of the farmland. The land was permanently fallowed. Water was converted from an agricultural right to a municipal right in a change of use case in the courts. And what has happened throughout the lower Arkansas Valley as we continue to look at this trend east of here is that we've lost about a third of the land that was historically irrigated here. And if you are a farmer and your community sees the disappearance of one or two farms, that does not have a huge impact on the community fabric. But once you start to begin to lose more, it may impact a packing shed. There may not be enough produce to supply one of the packing sheds that's in your community, and you may see the packing shed close down. Maybe that incentivizes a few more sales, and you see an irrigation equipment supplier on Main Street pull out. Maybe a tractor supplier does the same thing. And what begins to happen is psychology begins to take hold where people who are remaining in farming, remaining in agriculture, begin to hold back a little bit on their investments, because why purchase that equipment? Why purchase that extra parcel of land adjacent to you if you're not sure if there's going to be a future in farming 10, 15 years down the road? So there is a certain psychology that takes hold, and that psychology further incentivizes sales of water to cities. So it's a very interesting dynamic where we'd like to put a finger somewhere, but there's really no blaming for it, but it is a dynamic that we should be starting to ask ourselves, well, do we want to be handling our water resources in ways that create this kind of dynamic where certain communities succumb to trends that really are not beneficial for those communities as a whole. So in any event, we've lost a lot of irrigated ground down there. These transfers, I might just mention, have been, some have been initiated by cities, some have been initiated by farmers who have collectively organized and offered water rights for cities to purchase, farmers that are retiring, who have no heirs, and this is, they're a large source of their retirement funding is in that important financial asset. Here you can see in this slide what was once historically irrigated. These are the individual communities that we saw there. So purple is what was dried up from the historic 100% irrigation. Blue is what's left. This actually shows more water being in the system than there actually is because of the data available. So in Crowley County today, we have probably less than 10% of the historic irrigation water that we had serving farmland there. And this, of course, to illustrate the impact in an area that has historically always been somewhat poor, has really accelerated poverty in an area where there are not economic alternatives. There aren't other demands for that land. So it's not like in the South Platte Basin up north where there are alternative uses for a lot of land that has been dried up. And we can see today Crowley County, with poverty rates over 35% of the population living in the country, is one of the poorest counties in our nation. So that's our supply problem. Now we're going to move to problems of ecology. Then we'll start to look at some of the solution frameworks. So anytime we have an intervention, obviously, to deal with the problems of supply, even as a conservation organization, let's say we want to protect that farmland. So we work with a farmer, we place a conservation easement on the property, we tie the water to the land. That water then is preserved for agriculture. We help to protect the community fabric, but we're also pulling water, or continuing the pulling of water, out of a natural system, which also has an impact. And on the Arkansas, those waters, it's really a diverse river system. It's really neat. It moves through 7 different major ecoregions. This is a Palmer protected property up near Dome Rock on the west side of Pikes Peak, where some of the Arkansas River headwaters are. I think that's 4 Mile Creek there. Then it moves through the plains, through the shortgrass prairie, and as we move into Kansas and Oklahoma, we go through mixed grass, tall grass prairie, then into the Central Forest grasslands, the Ozark Mountain Forest, and then the Mississippi lowland forests. Now, one of the things that I expected to see in looking at the ecological history of this river as it was developed is, I thought, well, maybe we'll see the same thing that we saw in the Colorado, where as it becomes more and more appropriated, the supplies diminish. And will it look like this, the water has gone away, like where the Colorado is supposed to meet the Gulf of California? And in fact, in the Arkansas, the opposite started to happen as these waters began to be appropriated for agricultural purposes. The river, and especially its tributaries, had historically actually gone dry in late summer and early fall. The main stem would sometimes grow dry by the time it hit Rocky Ford, and particularly by the Kansas border in low water years, and the tributaries would regularly go dry. But as water started being diverted from the river and it was charging those soils around the river, the higher flows were sort of leveled out in the spring, and then that continual recharge actually helped keep flows in the river. So you had a more stable flow. And with a more stable flow, you also started to see this channelizing effect. So by the early 1900s, where the river crossed the Colorado-Kansas line, it had become more entrenched, and the width of the river had decreased from half of its length before irrigation had started. So some changes even before our major engineering projects that began to happen real early. And even small changes have some significant impacts as we look at downstream ecosystems and environments. Here you can see a native sweat bee, which as a pollinator comes out quite late in the spring. And when the honeybee was introduced into the valley in order to pollinate crops earlier, automatically farmers are able to bring water out earlier, they're able to plant earlier, and that has an impact as well. So even these interventions that we think of as, this may be a terrestrial intervention, but it has an impact as well. As we look at the system as it changes, you can see that the volume from the semi-arid regions in Colorado and Kansas into the wetter regions of Oklahoma and Arkansas are beginning to carry a lot more, not just water, but volumes of sediment. Sediment that is, put to work in these different sort of land formation processes that rivers are an important part of. And the Arkansas is a major sediment carrier of the Mississippi River, along with the Missouri and the Ohio. And here on this system, as we start to look at other interventions that have taken place, hopefully, there we go, we can see that there are a lot more dams within the system as we go downstream, 486 total. Again, thinking about, how are these getting deployed, built? Almost 60% of them are serving local purposes. 60% are built in this period right here between 1960 and 1980. And this overall is really having an impact not only on the flow regime, but also on the amount of sediment that is moving down the river and into the Mississippi. And as I said at the start of our talk, really what we want to do is not only look at these problems of supply, but when we look at the problems of ecology, let's follow the freshwater journey all the way till its end. So not just the end of the Arkansas Basin here, but where it continues, where that sediment charge is going, and where it finally discharges into the Gulf on the Mississippi Delta. Here, to see how important that sedimentation process is, this is an animation done by Jeff Carney at the LSU Coastal Sustainability Studio, highlighting, essentially, if I can get this to work here, give me 1 minute, highlighting how, these processes help to form the delta. Essentially, from the end of the Ice Age, we're looking at about 7,000 years ago. You guys aren't going to be able to see this, the timeline here. But if you watch the formation of the Mississippi Delta, as we approach the present, some landforms are going to start to become familiar to you. Now here you can see the different meanders and bends and the changing nature of the river. We're starting to get to an area where we begin to see the delta take shape as we know it today. We begin to see a basin form that you'll soon recognize as Lake Pontchartrain, near where the city of New Orleans is established. We're about 1,000 years out right now on our 7,000-year journey watching this, but it is a huge ecological, geological process that has essentially formed this land base. And now we're finally getting close to the present. We're beginning to see the boot down below New Orleans take shape here. And this is pretty much what we look like today. Now, if we look at the same area, this boot just south of New Orleans in this NOAA image, you can see this interesting patchwork of land building that has taken place in the Gulf. But beginning in essentially the 1930s, with a lot of dam construction, levee construction that followed the Flood Control Act of 1928, following the Great Mississippi Flood of 1927, that process was altered. And if you look carefully at what has happened since then, in the next NOAA image, you'll see that a lot of that land building process there has been reversed. And so this is land that we had that has now essentially disappeared. If I take that back, here's the boot down at the Mississippi Delta, and again, here, what has transpired over the last 70 years. We've lost about 2,000 square miles. It's an area that's the size of the Rhode Island. That loss is continuing at a very fast rate. And here we are on the 10th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina. And I think it is a poignant time to note that the devastating floods of 1927, which precipitated the Flood Control Act, killed 500 people, destroyed 130,000 homes. The death toll was not nearly what we saw in Hurricane Katrina with nearly 1,800. And we know we have rising sea levels. We know we have problems with the levees. But we also know that a storm surge is much more effective as a surge when it does not have a natural protective barrier like we see missing from this slide right here. So a lot of the reason that Hurricane Katrina was so damaging was in fact because of the land loss that the Mississippi Delta is facing. And in the Coastal Master Plan for the state of Louisiana, the plan takes a look at what happens in a do-nothing scenario by 2050, and this is the total accumulated loss, both historic of the last 70 years and what will happen by 2050 of land on the Delta that we will lose. And of course, you will see that New Orleans will be truly a coastal city, and there will be no protective barrier there in a do-nothing scenario. So this, I think, is really one of the exciting things about studying this river system, this tributary of the Mississippi, and looking at these freshwater flows. Anytime that a project was done under the Flood Control Act, you needed a cost-benefit analysis. And this is a great example, I think, of how we just could not have, at the time, quantified economically the ecosystem services that these natural flood regimes are providing us. Today, and people are starting to quantify this, what is the cost going to be in life and property if we lose this land? We've already lost more life in one hurricane than we lost during the Great Flood of 27. So I think this should give us a degree of humility as we intervene on these systems, and it should also give us pause to really think about we do not know generally the values in total that our natural environment is providing us. We think we have ideas, but oftentimes it is only in retrospect that we get a full sense of the scope and scale of just how valuable these services are. Now, this is indicative of a real change in thinking that we are looking at this century. If you look at the Mississippi Valley Committee report following the Flood Control Act of the 20th century, it says the ideal river, which would have a uniform flow, does not exist in nature. In other words, the ideal river is something we need to be working to create. The thinking today is that to protect not only freshwater biodiversity, but the ecosystem services upon which human life depends, natural flow variability or some semblance of it must be maintained. And this is a wonderful illustration that Kim Lutz, the director of the Connecticut River program at the Nature Conservancy, gave me. These hydrograph illustrations that show the river flow in a dam-altered flow pattern and a natural flow pattern. And she likens this to an EKG. It's like the pulse of the river. And in an EKG, you never want to see a flat line like this. You want to see a natural flow regime like this. And if we look at her work on the Connecticut, which is doing a lot of analysis, because it's such a dammed river, and many of our rivers are, we have to say, well, we don't know what the natural flow regime used to look like. She's doing a lot of work to look at that. But one of the things that we do know is that there are all sorts of interrelated processes taking place because of these flow regimes. We have, here on the Connecticut again, we have silver maples and eastern cottonwoods that are dispersing seeds in the high flow, so the seeds are spreading. The growing season, when these seeds settle, sprout, and really strengthen and take root, is happening during the low flows. The high flows for the American shad, they're migrating to spawn during the high flows. As those flows start to wane, spawning takes place, and then the juveniles are growing and beginning their migration during the low flows here. So really essential integrated processes happening with these flows. So with that put forward as the sort of sample of issues of supplies that we face on some of these rivers and the problems, the ecological problems we're facing, let's start to look at some of the frameworks that conservation groups are working within. And obviously, having just looked at the hydrograph, you can see that it's not just a historic event that the Colorado has reached the sea again here. That pulse flow is part of a very important ecological process taking place in that river. And that was, you can see the image here in the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy's quarterly Landlines magazine. That was essentially enabled by a national agreement, Minute 319, and then the work of a lot of conservation groups that essentially work to manage flows without impacting other water rights users between two major reservoirs. Also involved a lot of individuals, Mexican farmers who water rights were acquired from in a voluntary way to help sustain these flows. It's just a really neat project. In some ways, this is like a water banking project. And water banks are essentially, they're market-based mechanisms where when we have adequate storage, we can forego use of water. A user can forego use and then bank that water and have that water then feed supplies at another time. We essentially have that happening on the Arkansas River in the voluntary flow management program. How many of you have rafted on the Arkansas River? Nobody here in this room has rafted. Thank you. God. Talk's over. We're going home. So that is a voluntary flow management program really initiated by the rafting industry, and then Trout Unlimited got involved because what's good for rafters is not necessarily the same kind of flow that is good for fish, but it's a voluntary flow management that tries to replicate more of these peak flows. It sustains them more into the late summer months for the rafting, but it's one example of that. The other example, large-scale example that we can look at is what's happening down on the Mississippi again with the sedimentation, the halting of sedimentation problems. And if we look here, let me get this to the right place, and Jeff Kearney's animation again. We're not going to undo all of the levees and dams that have been built on the Mississippi River, but we do need to start thinking about how we can reestablish some of these sedimentation processes and get river flowing out of this man-made channel that has been constructed. So this animation here, this engineering design, shows an actual diversion from the main stem of the Mississippi that is bringing water out, trying to recreate some of those natural flood regimes. Down here, you see the hydrograph, right? You see the river, this new system it's creating, have a pulse. And then, of course, you see at the high points that sediment is starting to be delivered again, and you start to see this land building process occurring once more. So this is a plan that has been many years in the works and continues to get delayed a little bit by politics, but we're hoping pretty soon under the Coastal Master Plan that it will be something that, that we see starting to take place and see if it can have an impact. The other thing that is important to consider is not just flow variability, but do we have flows at all? This is a picture of a stream in Montana, a before and after picture of Racetrack Creek, and this is pretty common to a lot of smaller tributaries out west where the system has been so appropriated that there are times during the year that it runs dry. And the right to appropriate water is an inherent part of our Constitution in the state of Colorado. It says the right to divert the unappropriated waters of any natural stream to beneficial use shall never be denied. So you and I are constitutionally guaranteed our right to be able to appropriate water to meet our needs within this prior appropriation system. So our rights, if we were to go out and develop a resource and demonstrate need today, may be very junior, but we still have the right to go and do that. It wasn't until the 1970s that we realized that this is really having a detrimental impact on our river. Does the river have any rights? And under the legal context in our country, a river does not have legal rights, so to speak, but we do have some legislation created in 73 through Senate Bill 7397 that established Instream Flows as a new type of right. They are held by different entities throughout the West. Some can be held by land trusts in some states. In Colorado, they're held by the Colorado Water Conservation Board. And what you see here is an example of a water trust that operates similar to a land trust. Actually, this may have been a land trust project up here in Montana, but essentially a conservation entity, a land trust or a water trust, worked with a rancher who had very senior water rights to establish a more efficient irrigation system, which created a surplus of water that was then designated to in-stream flow and reestablished a trout fishery that really hadn't been in existence for about 100 years. Great example of what conservation groups are doing that can work with water rights to meet both the needs of agriculture and the needs of the stream ecology. And I guess finally, Oh, there is one other part. We need to get back to the super ditch, to the lower Arkansas Valley, where this is a photo of, and talk about the buy and dry and some of the frameworks that are happening for solutions down there. So this is an aerial photo. You can see the main branch of the Arkansas here as it travels east from the city of Pueblo into the farm ground. This is over the town of Avondale on the east side of the city of Pueblo. You know, what has really been needed by communities down there is an alternative to the buy and dry, but it has to be an alternative that doesn't just work for the communities, it needs to work for the cities as well. And one of the tricky things about you know, these owning water as a farmer is that, you know, you have this asset that is only going to increase in value over time. You think, why are we selling an asset that's going to increase in value? And part of it is because you're limited in the ways that you can make money off of that asset. And essentially there have been two main ways that you've been able to make money. You can grow food, and then, you know, the commodities market has a big influence on how much money you're making growing food, and you can also sell that water. It's been very difficult to lease water, although it has been done in the valley, but the super ditch is trying to make water leasing and water sharing between agriculture and cities more feasible. And essentially what it wants to do is it wants to act as a lease negotiating agent, and I shouldn't say wants to, because it actually, even though it has been a project that has been in development for not quite a decade, but close to it. It actually got launched this year and is a project that is supplying water to the Security Fountain and the town of Fowler as a pilot project. But essentially, there are a lot of problems with leasing water for both farmers and cities. The premise behind this concept here, if I can move the slide, and this here, you know, here we see, you know, here's land that's irrigated. And actually, a large portion of this water was purchased not too long ago by the city of Pueblo that's leasing water back to farmers. 16 years left on the lease. This is more buy and dry ground owned by the city of Aurora, closer to Rocky Ford. So this is what we look like today. But again, trying to prevent that, you know, if you have a farm that wants to lease to a city, there are you know, some issues inherent in that. One is that, you know, a farm doesn't want to lease all the time, it wants to grow food some of the time. But what if you begin to rotationally fallow some of your fields? What if you begin to, say, dry up a third of your farmland once in 10 years, and then another third once in that same 10 years, and another third once in that same 10 years, and you allow this rotational fallowing to take place that actually allows that field to rest and can align itself pretty well with good soil management practices. Can you then take that water and lease to the city? Well, it is problematic for a number of reasons, but one of the reasons is that it is a limited supply going to the city. It's also a lease, and why would a city want to lease a supply when there may be another water buyer that comes and purchases that water, and when the lease period ends, the water is no longer available? That's not where you want to be as a city water manager, seeing supplies that were available to you, where you can permanently secure them at a low price, all of a sudden not being available anymore and needing to secure them at a higher price. So for a city, there needs to be some guarantee that that water is going to be there, and it also needs a greater pool. So in terms of the greater pool, what if it wasn't one farm, but what if it was multiple farms, rotationally fallowing, pooling those water supplies? The super ditch becomes the lease negotiating agent. What then? Well, again, how do you guarantee the supplies will be there? Well, what if conservation groups are putting conservation easements, whether it's a Palmer Land Trust or a Lower Arkansas Valley Water Conservancy District on those farms, tying that water to the land? Then you have a guarantee that the water is there. The farms are essentially acting like they're storing water, essentially, the same way that we would think of a reservoir as storing water, but they're storing it and using it for other purposes beyond storage, namely food growing the majority of the time. What if the leases had terms for renewal? certain terms that guided market-based mechanisms that could guarantee that cities were not going to be paying too much or farmers were going to be paying too little. You can see that this is a very sort of complex undertaking when we think about long-term, and all of us who desire a sense of greater permanence, approach a concept like this with some hesitation. But it is really, in terms of concept, becoming more and more agreed upon that this is, perhaps one of the best community-oriented solutions to addressing our supply problems there. Now, this takes us to the concluding point, and that is how do these conservation groups operate within this? Well, consider again that these water rights are private property rights. We're obtaining some kind of interest in property, which means we have to think about how we want to manage those rights. Do we want to encumber them when we're protecting a property with a conservation easement? There are several things we can do. We can prohibit a change of use on a water right, working with a farmer on a conservation easement, which guarantees that that water is always going to be there for their heirs and future generations to farm. It can also help protect the framework of the fabric of the community. We can allow a change of water rights within a defined parameter, which is in some ways what the super ditch is doing. It's tying water to the land, but it's allowing a change of that right within defined leasing parameters. Or we can explicitly require a change, as we saw with that example of Racetrack Creek in terms of focusing on Instream Flows, acquiring property that has agricultural water, maybe creating greater efficiencies on that property, and then dedicating some of that water to benefit the in-stream flows and ecosystem health. Now, how do you decide between these things? Well, I think one of the keys is to be very engaged with the network of water users on the whole system. And one of the thinkers on water networks who I really came to admire greatly during my time out east was Larry Susskind, who's a professor at MIT, and he wrote this article called Water and Democracy, and I'm just going to read this quote for you here because I think it's very important. And Eric had mentioned our Colorado water supply plan, and that has been created largely through a process that I think that Larry describes here. It has been a grassroots process beginning in the major river basins, and then where thinking around our water supply management has come up into the Interbasin Compact Committee, and we've really started thinking in a much less fractured way about how we're going to manage these water resources for ecosystem health, for municipal supply, for agricultural supply. So Larry's quote is this. He says, "Around the world, we continue to treat the allocation of water as a technical problem when in fact it is primarily a social problem. In most democratic countries, government officials make water allocation decisions. Citizens depend on these officials and their technical advisors to take account of both technical and political considerations. Under some circumstances, citizens can challenge water management decisions in court. This is not enough. More direct democracy involving stakeholders before such decisions are made can produce faster, increasingly sustainable results, and as he goes on to say, they can eliminate waste and they can help eliminate a sort of this juxtaposition of winners, losers scenario." That's from his article, Water and Democracy, New Roles for Civil Society in Water Governance. So as you all begin your exploration this year, looking at these different scales of Western water, whether you're looking at a very specific intervention that may be on a specific property or a very large basin-wide approach that needs to be taken to address more significant issues like we're seeing in the Mississippi Delta. I hope whatever scale you're looking at, that this has been a helpful framework to kind of set the ball rolling. And again, I'm really grateful that you asked me here tonight to speak, so thank you.